A photograph sits in a wallet carried for decades. It shows a man's corpse, neck broken, hanging from a gallows. The person who carries this photo isn't a prosecutor or historian. It's the dead man's son. Every night, he takes out that photo and re-executes his father in his imagination. This is just one way the children of Nazi leaders have dealt with an impossible inheritance. But not all chose this path. In 1940, life seemed perfect for a small group of German children. They lived in grand villas, wore expensive clothes, and rode in chauffeured cars. Their fathers held the highest positions in the Third Reich. These children were the princes and princesses of Nazi Germany, surrounded by servants, protected from hardship, utterly unaware of what their fathers were doing just miles away from their comfortable homes. Gudrun Himmler celebrated her 12th birthday in 1941. Her father, Heinrich Himmler, architect of the final solution, doted on his little girl. He called her Puppy, his little doll. He telephoned her regularly from wherever his duties took him, sent her flowers and chocolates, and brought her small gifts from his travels. That same year, he took her on a special outing to Dachau concentration camp. Young Gudrun strolled through the grounds with her beloved father, while just yards away, prisoners were beaten, starved, and burned in the crematorium. In her diary, she wrote that it had been a wonderful day. Etta Goering, born in 1938, was Hermann Goering's only child. The Reichsmarschall commissioned elaborate dresses for his daughter and never went to bed without kissing her goodnight. He posed for photographs with her, the proud father displaying his beloved child to the world. She knew nothing of the art her father had stolen, the industries he had confiscated, or the people who died under his command. In Krakow, Poland, 5 children played in the opulent Wawel Castle. Their father was Hans Frank, Hitler's governor-general of occupied Poland. The youngest, Nicholas, drove his toy car through the castle's corridors, while his father signed death warrants in nearby offices. The Frank children had Polish servants, access to every luxury, and absolutely no understanding that their father was presiding over what would later be called the largest slaughterhouse in history. Martin Bormann's 10 children grew up surrounded by the trappings of power. Their father, Hitler's private secretary, ensured they wanted for nothing. The eldest son, Martin Adolf, was Hitler's godson. The children were raised to worship the Führer and believe completely in National Socialist ideology. These children knew only privilege, affection, and security. Their fathers might have been mass murderers, but to them, they were simply Papa who came home tired from important work. The disconnect between public crimes and private family life was absolute. And then, the war ended. May 1945 brought the collapse of everything these children had known. Within days, their entire world vanished. Fathers disappeared, either fleeing, captured, or dead by their own hand. The comfortable villas were seized, the servants vanished, the privileges evaporated, and slowly, horrifyingly, the truth began to emerge. For Gudrun Himmler, the shock came immediately. Allied forces arrested her and her mother just weeks after her father took poison to avoid capture. She was 15 years old. They were interned in various camps across Italy, France, and Germany, moved from place to place as the Allies decided what to do with the families of Nazi leaders. In Rome, Gudrun went on a hunger strike, refusing to eat until she grew dangerously weak. She and her mother were eventually brought to Nuremberg to testify at the trials. Released in November 1946, Gudrun would later describe this period as the most difficult time of her life. She felt she and her mother were being made to atone for her father's sins, as if his crimes somehow belonged to them as well. But Gudrun never accepted that her father had committed any crimes. As photographs of concentration camps appeared in newspapers, as testimony emerged of the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, as the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable, Gudrun refused to believe it. She insisted it was all Allied propaganda, lies designed to besmirch her father's good name. She would maintain this position for the rest of her life. Etta Goering and her mother, Emmy, faced similar treatment. Arrested shortly after Germany's surrender, they too spent years in internment camps. Emmy, desperate and terrified, begged prison wardens for shelter because she had nowhere else to go. Mother and daughter lived in Allied facilities not as prisoners, but as people who had lost everything and had no resources to rebuild. When they were finally released in 1946, Etta was 8 years old. She settled with her mother in Munich and eventually studied law, becoming a law clerk. Her mother, through her connections with surviving Nazi networks, introduced her to people like Winifred Wagner, daughter-in-law of Hitler's favorite composer, who had become a prominent figure in post-war right-wing circles. For the Frank children, the end came with brutal suddenness. Their father was captured, tried at Nuremberg, and executed in October 1946. Nicholas Frank was 7 years old when his father died on the gallows. His mother told him and his siblings that their father had been murdered by vengeful Jews. The comfortable life in Krakow was gone forever, replaced by shame, poverty, and the growing realization of what their father had actually done. But each child would process this trauma differently. Some would cling to denial, others would embrace the truth and spend their lives trying to atone, and a few would chart paths somewhere in between. Gudrun Berwitz, as she became known after marrying far-right propagandist Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, never wavered in her defense of her father. As she aged, her devotion to Heinrich Himmler's memory only intensified. She became the godmother of the post-war neo-Nazi movement, a Nazi princess who dedicated her life to rehabilitating the reputation of SS members and helping war criminals avoid justice. In 1951, an organization called Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, was founded to provide legal and financial assistance to former SS members facing prosecution. The organization was officially established by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Isenberg, who had connections to the aristocracy, conservative circles, and the Catholic Church. But Gudrun quickly became its most prominent figure, its star attraction, and eventually its de facto leader. The organization operated quietly but effectively, helping convicted war criminals like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, evade justice. The organization's methods were sophisticated and deliberate. They provided legal fees for accused war criminals, ensuring they had quality representation in court. They arranged safe houses and retirement facilities for elderly Nazis who might otherwise face prosecution. They facilitated escapes for those in immediate danger of arrest, helping them reach countries without extradition treaties. They offered moral support to men who had participated in genocide, treating them not as criminals but as soldiers who had simply followed orders. Stille Hilfe operated through networks of sympathizers across Europe and South America. They maintained connections with right-wing political groups, sympathetic clergy, and wealthy donors who shared their belief that former SS men were victims rather than perpetrators. The organization received funding from donations, often from former Nazis who had successfully hidden their pasts and rebuilt fortunes in post-war Germany. Gudrun personally assisted Anton Maloth, a supervisor at Theresienstadt concentration camp, who had been convicted of beating prisoners to death. She arranged for him to stay at an expensive nursing home in Pullach, on land once owned by Rudolf Hess. When authorities eventually tracked Maloth down and he was sentenced to life in prison, Stille Hilfe provided financial support to his family and continued working for his release. The organization helped SS officer Erich Priebke, the murderer of Italian partisans who had hidden in Argentina for decades before being discovered. When Priebke faced extradition and trial, Stille Hilfe was there with legal support and public advocacy, claiming he had been merely following orders. They worked to prevent the extradition of Danish SS officer Søren Kam, wanted in Denmark for murders, including the execution of newspaper editor Carl Henrik Clemensen in Copenhagen. Stille Hilfe's lawyers argued against his extradition on technical grounds, using every legal maneuver available to protect him from facing justice in his homeland. Gudrun attended underground reunions of former SS officers, gatherings often held in Austria where elderly war criminals could meet without fear of prosecution. These events, held annually in places like Ulrichsburg, brought together hundreds of former SS men who still believed in the cause they had served. Witnesses who attended these meetings in the 2000s and 2010s reported that Gudrun was treated like royalty, as a Nazi princess whose presence validated their continued loyalty to a defeated ideology. Former SS men would line up to speak with her, hanging on her every word, seeking her approval, grateful for her continued loyalty to the cause. She moved through these gatherings with the confidence of someone who believed history had gotten it wrong, that her father and his comrades had been misunderstood servants of a greater good. Observers described the atmosphere as menacing, with Gudrun surrounded constantly by dozens of high-ranking former SS officers who viewed her as living proof that their ideology could survive across generations. She denied the Holocaust ever occurred. She insisted the concentration camps had been work facilities, nothing more. The photographs, the testimony, the meticulously documented evidence of systematic murder meant nothing to her. Her father had been a good man, she insisted, misunderstood and maligned by history. Everything she did for the rest of her life was dedicated to this false narrative. In the 1960s, it was revealed that Gudrun had worked as a secretary for West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service from 1961 to 1963, employed under an assumed name. The agency was headed at the time by Reinhard Gehlen, who had recruited former Nazis based on their anti-communist credentials and Eastern European connections. The old networks had survived intact, and Gudrun moved through them with ease. She rarely spoke to journalists. In one of her few interviews, given in 1959, she revealed nothing of substance, offering only platitudes about her private life. She wore a silver brooch her father had given her, depicting 4 horses arranged in a swastika pattern. It was a deliberate choice, a silent statement of her beliefs. Gudrun Burwitz died on May 24, 2018, at age 88. She had 2 children and lived quietly in a Munich suburb. To the end, she remained an unrepentant Nazi, a Holocaust denier, and an active supporter of neo-Nazi causes. She never expressed remorse, never acknowledged her father's crimes, never wavered in her devotion to a dead ideology and a monstrous man. Etta Goering chose a similar path, though perhaps with less active involvement in far-right politics. She defended her father throughout her life, insisting he had been a good man caught in unfortunate circumstances. She fought legal battles to retain artwork her father had stolen, and successfully sued the Bavarian government to recover jewelry that had been confiscated after the war. She never married, never had children. When she died in 2018, the Goering line ended with her. Throughout her life, she avoided public attention when possible, but never renounced her father or his role in the Nazi regime. Wolf Rudiger Hess, son of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, spent his entire adult life trying to clear his father's name. Rudolf Hess had flown to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. Captured and imprisoned, he was eventually tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment. He remained the sole prisoner in Spandau prison until 1987, when he died at age 93. The official cause of death was listed as being self-inflicted, but Wolf rejected this conclusion. He insisted his father had been murdered by British intelligence. He campaigned tirelessly for his father's release, for recognition that Rudolf Hess had been a man of peace, misunderstood, and unjustly imprisoned. When his second grandchild was born on Hitler's birthday, Wolf proudly wrote to his imprisoned father to share the news. These children never broke free from their father's shadows. They lived their entire lives in service to a lie, defending the indefensible, refusing to acknowledge reality. Not all children of Nazi leaders chose denial. Some underwent transformations that took them in radically different directions. Martin Adolf Bormann, Hitler's godson and eldest of Martin Bormann's 10 children, was raised to embody Nazi ideology. His childhood was spent in absolute devotion to the Führer and everything the Third Reich represented. But after the war, after seeing the evidence, after understanding what his father and his godfather had actually done, Martin Bormann Jr. did something extraordinary. In 1947, he converted to Roman Catholicism and entered the priesthood. He spent his life as a missionary, working in Africa, dedicating himself to God and to undoing whatever small portion of the evil his father had represented. He never publicly condemned his father in the vicious terms others would use, but his life choices spoke volumes. He died in 1989, having spent 4 decades in religious service. Rolf Mengele struggled with a different kind of burden. His father, Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, had escaped to South America after the war. Rolf grew up in Germany being told his father was dead, only to learn as a teenager that Josef Mengele was alive and living in hiding. In 1977, Rolf traveled to Brazil to meet his father. The meeting was tense and difficult. Rolf confronted his father about the experiments at Auschwitz, about the children Josef Mengele had tortured and killed in the name of pseudoscientific research. The elder Mengele showed no remorse, offered justifications. insisted he had simply been doing his duty as a scientist. Rolf left Brazil understanding that his father was both a monster and his parent. He publicly stated that he found his father's actions abominable, but couldn't completely sever the blood tie. He lived quietly in Germany, avoiding publicity when possible, carrying the weight of a surname synonymous with evil. Brigitte Höss, daughter of Rudolf Höss, the first commandant of Auschwitz, tried a different approach: forgetting. She refused to discuss her father or her childhood. She built a life completely separate from her past and did everything possible to erase the memories of growing up in a villa adjacent to history's most notorious death camp. Her brother Rainer, however, couldn't forget. He was haunted by childhood memories of playing in their comfortable home, while just yards away people were being murdered in gas chambers. As an adult, he came forward with photographs from the family estate, images that showed the disturbing proximity between the Höss family's comfortable life and the machinery of death they lived beside. Most disturbingly, Rainer attempted to profit from this dark heritage. He contacted Yad Vashem, offering to sell them his grandfather's personal items: a fireproof box with SS insignia, slides from Auschwitz that had never been seen publicly, letters from Rudolf Höss's imprisonment in Krakow. The offer was met with outrage. The grandson of Auschwitz's commandant was attempting to monetize his family's role in genocide. These children occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, neither fully defending nor completely condemning their fathers, trying to find ways to live with an impossible inheritance. Nicholas Frank chose the most extreme response of all. He dedicated his life to destroying his father's memory, to ensuring Hans Frank would be remembered as the monster he was, to making certain the world never forgot or forgave. His approach was not merely to acknowledge his father's crimes, but to actively crusade against any possibility of rehabilitation or sympathy. In 1987, after 40 years of research and soul-searching, Nicholas published a book about his father titled Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, which translates as The Father, a Settling of Accounts. The book was serialized in the German magazine Stern and caused immediate and sustained controversy. Nicholas referred to his father as a slime hole of a Hitler fanatic, language so extreme it shocked even readers who agreed with his fundamental point. He called Hans Frank a fawning coward, a pompous actor whose speeches were the drivel of a numbskull, and a murderer deserving of no sympathy or understanding. He questioned whether his father's claimed religious conversion in his Nuremberg cell had been genuine or just another performance, the final act of a man who had spent his life performing for audiences. Nicholas expressed regret that a 1944 assassination attempt against his father had failed, stating explicitly that Germany would have been better off if Hans Frank had died years earlier. The book was savage, unforgiving, and deliberately shocking. This wasn't the measured condemnation of a historian maintaining professional distance. This was personal, visceral hatred poured onto every page. Nicholas didn't just condemn his father's crimes, he attacked the man himself with a ferocity that made many readers deeply uncomfortable. Some praised his brutal honesty and his refusal to soften the truth. Others felt his approach bordered on hysteria, that the relentless vitriol became offensive and even counterproductive, that it said as much about Nicholas's unresolved trauma as it did about Hans Frank's crimes. But Nicholas wasn't finished. He had opened a vein and was determined to drain it completely. He followed up with a book about his mother, My German Mother, published in 2005. In it, he described Brigitte Frank as a sleazy fur dealer who had been complicit in her husband's crimes through her silence and her enthusiastic enjoyment of the privileges his position provided. He documented her affairs, her ambitions, her materialistic obsessions, and her complete moral failure to resist or even question what her husband was doing. Then came Brother Norman in 2013, documenting the painful disagreements between Nicholas and his eldest brother about their childhood in occupied Poland and their diverging views of their parents. Norman had loved their father and, while acknowledging his crimes intellectually, could never bring himself to condemn the man emotionally. The tension between the brothers was never resolved. Norman died in 2010, and Nicholas wrote about him with a mixture of love and frustration, unable to understand how someone who had witnessed the same things could reach such different conclusions. Nicholas carried a photograph of his father's corpse in his wallet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder and a ritual object. The photo showed Hans Frank's body after his execution, neck broken from hanging, the physical evidence that the man had faced justice. Each night, Nicholas would mentally re-execute both parents, imagining their deaths over and over as a kind of psychological cleansing, a way to process rage and trauma that had nowhere else to go. He described his father's execution as the event that saved him from a totally screwed up life. If Hans Frank had survived the Nuremberg trials, if he had been freed or escaped, Nicholas believed he would have been destroyed by the burden of having a living father who represented such evil. The fact that Hans Frank died when Nicholas was only 7, before the relationship could become more complex, allowed Nicholas to develop his hatred without the complications that continued contact would have brought. In extensive interviews over the decades, Nicholas spoke about his childhood memories with brutal, almost clinical clarity. He described being taken to concentration camps by the family nanny, Hilda, a woman he loved and who protected him from his father's rejection. At these camps, for young Nicholas and his brother Norman's amusement, guards would force malnourished prisoners to sit on a donkey that would then be made to jump, throwing the weakened prisoners to the ground. The brothers would laugh, not understanding they were watching torture. He remembered being told that a sad-looking prisoner was a witch who would be dead very soon, so he needn't worry about her. He recalled a Polish servant who accidentally soiled bedsheets with soot, and his mother screaming that the man would be sent to the camps. Young Nicholas, who had befriended the Pole and felt affection for him, began crying at the threat, which made his mother stop her tirade and comfort her son instead. This memory taught him that, even as a child, he had unconsciously understood the camps represented something terrible. These memories and hundreds more shaped his adult understanding that he had lived in privilege built on the suffering of others, that every toy he had played with, every meal he had eaten, every moment of comfort had been paid for with Jewish and Polish blood. This knowledge drove his lifelong campaign to ensure no one could deny or minimize what his father had done. Nicholas was shunned by his father from early childhood. Hans Frank believed Nicholas was actually the son of Karl Lasch, a family friend who served as governor in the general government. This rejection, Nicholas later said, saved him. His siblings, who received their father's affection, had their brains poisoned by Nazi ideology. But Nicholas, kept at a distance, bonded with their nanny instead, and maintained a psychological separation from his father that ultimately allowed him to see the truth. His siblings took different paths. His sister Brigitte took her own life in 1981 at age 46. Nicholas believed it was because she didn't want to become older than their father, though she was also battling cancer at the time. His brother Norman became addicted to alcohol and, while privately proud of Nicholas's work, publicly criticized it for violating their father's deathbed advice to remain silent about the past. Norman died in 2010. Another sister died in South Africa. His brother Michael died in 1990. Nicholas is now the sole living child of Hans and Brigitte Frank. In his 80s, he continues to give interviews, to speak about his father's crimes, to insist that Germany must never forget the horrors of the Nazi era. He describes himself as loving Germany, but not trusting Germans. He estimates that, of Germany's 80 million people, only about 20 million are committed Democrats, and most of those are passive in their democratic engagement. He has been critical of contemporary Polish politics, which has sparked controversy. Some polls have suggested that the son of Poland's Nazi governor general has no right to criticize their government. Nicholas counters that the Polish soldiers who fought for their country's independence in World War II would not be satisfied with seeing their democracy eroded. His approach remains as uncompromising as ever. He despises his father. He wants the world to remember what Hans Frank did, to understand that the man who presided over the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in Poland was not some aberration, but a willing, enthusiastic participant in genocide. Some descendants chose another path entirely: escape. They couldn't defend their heritage because the evidence of crimes was too overwhelming. They couldn't forget it because the memories and the knowledge were inescapable. They couldn't confront it head-on because the psychological toll was too great. So they fled, seeking distance, anonymity, and the possibility of building lives untethered from their surnames. Bettina Goering, Hermann Goering's great-niece, ran away from home at age 13. She couldn't bear living in Germany, couldn't tolerate the associations that came with her last name. couldn't function in a society where people would inevitably discover her connection to the Reich Marshal. She lived on a commune in India for a time, seeking spiritual distance from her material and historical circumstances. Then she fled to the United States, eventually settling in the New Mexico desert, where she has lived in self-imposed exile for over 35 years. But physical distance wasn't enough. Even in America, even in the desert, she remained a Goering. The surname carried its poison across oceans and continents. So, she underwent voluntary sterilization to ensure the Goering genes would end with her generation. This wasn't a casual decision, but a deliberate act to break a genetic line she viewed as contaminated. She described herself as a healer and changed her last name to hide her identity from casual acquaintances. For decades, she refused to discuss her family connection to Nazi Germany. The topic was forbidden, too painful, too complicated to address. When she finally did speak publicly, appearing in the 2011 documentary Hitler's Children, she explained her decision to be sterilized with words that revealed the depth of her psychological burden. She feared that she might create another monster, that somehow the capacity for evil her great-uncle possessed might be encoded in her DNA, passed down generation to generation like a genetic curse. She worried that children she might have would carry the same potential for cruelty, the same moral blindness, the same capacity for monstrous acts that Hermann Goering had displayed. The idea was scientifically unfounded, but emotionally overwhelming. She chose certainty, chose to end the line rather than risk perpetuating whatever darkness might lurk in her bloodline. In the documentary, she met with Ruth Rich, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. The encounter was arranged by the filmmakers, but became something far more significant than a staged meeting for cameras. The two women represented opposite sides of the Nazi legacy: victims and perpetrators, those who had suffered and those whose families had inflicted that suffering. Their conversation was painful, halting, and deeply emotional. Bettina sought something from Ruth that Ruth couldn't necessarily provide: forgiveness, or at least absolution, or perhaps just acknowledgement that Bettina herself bore no personal guilt for crimes committed before she was born by a relative she had never met. Ruth struggled with her own emotions. She couldn't condemn Bettina personally, but she also couldn't simply grant forgiveness for crimes Bettina hadn't committed, but which had devastated Ruth's family. The meeting ended without clear resolution, but both women seemed to find some value in the encounter, some small measure of mutual understanding across an unbridgeable historical divide. Her brother Matthias took a different approach, but shared her deep discomfort with their heritage. He noted that when times were hard during their childhood in Germany, their parents would casually mention that they couldn't afford certain things because all their money had gone to the Jews, referring to reparation payments Germany made to Holocaust survivors and Israel. This casual anti-Semitism, this sense of being victimized by having to pay for Nazi crimes, permeated their upbringing and shaped their understanding of their family's relationship to history. Katrin Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's great niece, chose exile of a different sort. She married an Israeli Jew, an act that would have been unthinkable to her great-uncle, and which represented a deliberate rejection of everything he had stood for. For most of her life, she sought to hide her German identity, learning to speak multiple languages without a German accent. She would have been thrilled, she said, if people thought she was Dutch or Swedish, anything but German, anything that wouldn't invite questions about her family history. When she and her husband had their son, she realized she couldn't continue the family tradition of silence about the past. A new generation was beginning, and that child would eventually ask questions about his heritage, about his mother's family, about the great-great-uncle whose crimes had shaped world history. She decided she had to break the silence, to let this particular demon out of the bottle before it poisoned another generation. She wrote a book about her family, The Himmler Brothers, A German Family History, which explored how ordinary people became participants in extraordinary evil. Some family members cut off contact with her after the book's publication. They saw her work as a betrayal, airing family secrets that should have remained buried. For these descendants, the weight of their surnames became unbearable. They couldn't carry the burden in the places where they had been born, so they sought distance, anonymity, new identities. But even in exile, even after changing names and undergoing sterilization, the shadow remained. The question these children and grandchildren grapple with remains unanswered. How much responsibility do descendants bear for their ancestors' crimes? Gudrun Borwitz believed none. Her father's actions, in her view, were either justified or fabricated, and in any case had nothing to do with her beyond the bond of love between father and daughter. Nicholas Frank believed the opposite. He saw his father's crimes as a stain that could never be washed away, only confronted and condemned repeatedly, eternally. His responsibility, as he saw it, was to ensure no one forgot, no one forgave, no one allowed Hans Frank's memory to be rehabilitated. Others fell somewhere in between. They acknowledged their father's guilt, but questioned how much of that guilt transferred to children who had been too young to understand, who had loved their fathers as children, naturally loved their parents, who had no choice in being born into monstrous families. The documentary Hitler's Children brought together 5 descendants willing to speak on camera: Bettina Göring, Nicholas Frank, Katrin Himmler, Monika Goeth, daughter of Amon Goeth, the brutal commandant of Plazow, and Rainer Höss. Their conversations revealed the complexity of their situations. Each struggled with the tension between childhood memories of affectionate parents and adult knowledge of unconscionable crimes. Most descendants of Nazi leaders chose silence. When filmmaker Janusz Zaevi contacted 24 descendants for his documentary, the vast majority refused. Some hung up on him immediately. Others said family members had forbidden them from participating. The shame, the fear, the desire to move past history and build normal lives led most to avoid any public discussion of their heritage. The descendants who did speak often found the experience both painful and liberating. Bettina Göring said that confronting her family's past, meeting Ruth Rich, and speaking openly about her great-uncle helped her process emotions she had carried in silence for decades. Katrin Himmler found that breaking the family silence allowed her to give her son a more honest foundation for understanding his heritage. But for every descendant who chose to speak, dozens more remained hidden. They changed their names, moved to new countries, built lives separate from their father's legacies, and hoped the world would never discover their connection to history's darkest chapter. Today, most direct children of Nazi leaders have died. Gudrun Borwitz passed away in 2018. Etta Göring died the same year. Nicholas Frank, in his mid-80s, is among the few survivors. But their children, the grandchildren of Nazi leaders, are now middle-aged or older, and their children represent yet another generation further removed from the Third Reich. The question of inherited guilt doesn't diminish with time or distance. Rainer Höss's attempt to sell his grandfather's memorabilia demonstrates how some descendants still see their heritage as something to exploit. Others continue working with far-right groups, keeping the ideology alive. Still others fight actively against neo-Nazism, using their family names to add credibility to anti-fascist work. The descendants who defended their fathers accomplished little beyond prolonging their own suffering. Gudrun Borwitz spent 88 years in service to a dead man and a dead ideology, never allowing herself to move forward, always looking backward to a childhood that existed only in her selective memory. She helped war criminals evade justice, supported neo-Nazi causes, and died as she lived, unrepentant and unredeemed. The descendants who denounced their fathers at least achieved a kind of honesty, though often at tremendous personal cost. Nicholas Frank's relentless condemnation of his father destroyed relationships with siblings and made him a controversial figure. His work ensured Hans Frank would never be forgotten or rehabilitated, but it also consumed Nicholas's entire adult life. The descendants who fled found varying degrees of peace. Some, like Bettina Göring, eventually returned to face their heritage and found some measure of closure. Others remain in exile, living under different names, their connections to Nazi leaders unknown to neighbors and colleagues. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren face different challenges. They have no personal memories of the Third Reich, no relationship with the men who committed these crimes. Yet the surnames remain, the DNA persists, and the question of responsibility continues to echo through generations. Some have embraced their responsibility to speak against hatred and intolerance. Others simply want to live normal lives, free from the burden of crimes committed before they were born. And a troubling minority continue to defend or minimize their ancestors' actions, keeping Nazi ideology alive in new forms. The children of Nazi leaders show us that there is no single way to deal with monstrous inheritance. Some deny, Some condemn, some flee, some convert, some exploit. Each choice carries its own consequences, its own costs, its own kind of truth. What remains clear is that the sins of the fathers do not disappear with death. They echo through time, shaping descendants, demanding responses, forcing choices. How those descendants respond tells us something not just about them, but about the nature of guilt, responsibility, and the weight of history itself. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.